Miss Level here. Today we're going to be talking about asking and answering questions in a nonfiction text. What is a nonfiction text? A nonfiction text is something that actually can happen or has happened. It can be based off of a historical event or a scientific text. So, as a reader, when we read a nonfiction text, we need to be thinking about questions that we might have to answer as well as questions that we want to ask. Whenever we're thinking of questions, we need to think of the 5 W's. The 5 W's are who, what, when, where, and why. There also is a 6th one, which is how. So let's talk about these further. Okay, guys, now we're going to talk about the 5 W's that we will find in a nonfiction text. Let's get started. So first we have who. Whenever we come across a who question in a nonfiction text, this question is about a person. So whenever you find who in a question, you need to be looking for a person mentioned in the story. I have an example here of a question. It's who invented the light bulb? So if I was reading a story, I would look for invented and light bulb in the passage and look to see who invented it. Next is where. Whenever we're come across a where question, we're looking for a place that's mentioned in the story. My example is, where did George Washington live? So if I was reading a story about George Washington, I would look for places that were mentioned in the story to see if he lived there. Our third W is what. Whenever we come across a what question, we're thinking about nouns and actions. So, for example, you could come across the question, what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg? So whenever we see this question, we're thinking about the actions or different nouns that happen in the story that deal with the Battle of Gettysburg. Next is when. Whenever we have a when question, we need to be looking in our story for a time or a date that's mentioned. My example is, when did Isaac Newton discover gravity? So, while you look in the story, look for dates, years, or times. Our last W question is why. Whenever you have a why question, it's asking for a reason or a purpose. So, for example, why do some birds migrate to the south? We need to find the reason why they do this. Now, how does not start with the W, but it does start a lot of questions that we might see when reading a story. So whenever you see a how question, it means in what way, by what means. For example, how do bees make honey? Whenever we see this, we need to see the process on how bees make honey. Now that we've talked about the 5 W's and how, let's watch a quick video that recaps everything we just talked about. All right, guys, now that we've learned about the 5 W's, let's go ahead and read a nonfiction text. This text is about Pluto, so let's get started. Poor Pluto. It's bad enough to be the runt of the group, but to be told after 75 years that you're not even a member of the club. What an insult. Pluto was first discovered in 1930. Until 2006, students were taught that it was the 9th and smallest planet in the solar system. Smaller than the Earth's moon, it is not even as wide as the United States. Pluto is made up almost entirely of rock and ice. It is so far away from Earth that the NASA's New Horizons spacecraft took almost 10 years to get very close to it. Pluto's full orbit around the Sun lasts almost 250 Earth years. But as small as it is, as cold as it is, as far from the Sun as it is, for all those years it was considered the 9th planet of the solar system, until Eris came around. Eris was discovered in 2005. It is about the same size as Pluto. And like Pluto, It is part of the Kuiper Belt, a ring of objects that circle the outer edge of the solar system. After Eris was discovered, scientists had to make a decision. Either Eris was the 10th planet in the solar system, or it is not a planet at all. And if Eris wasn't a planet, could Pluto be considered one? Scientists made new rules for what is counted as a planet and decided that neither Pluto nor Eris qualified. A new category was created, dwarf planet. The official list of planets in the solar system went from 9 to 8, and Pluto and Eris became members of the Dwarf Planet Club. So long for planet Pluto, but at least it no longer has to be the littlest guy in the club. In fact, Pluto is one of the bigger dwarf planets. Maybe Pluto doesn't have it so bad after all. Now that we've read our story, let's look at these images. So in this first picture up here, we have a picture of Pluto. So this is what our planet Pluto, or our former planet Pluto, looked like. In our second image, we have a picture of the Kuiper Belt, and we can see here's the sun. This is the orbit that Neptune takes. This is the orbit of Pluto. And here is the orbit of Eris. Now that we've read our story, let's go ahead and answer some 5W questions on our text. Our first question is, when was Eris discovered? So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to box in when. By boxing this in, I'm reminding myself that I'm looking for a time or a date that's mentioned in the story. Am I looking for a time or date relating to Pluto? No. I'm looking for a time or date that deals with when Eris was discovered. So, I know in the beginning portion of my story, I talked about Pluto a lot. So, I need to look for where Eris comes up in our story. So, in this paragraph, it starts talking about how Pluto was no longer a planet because Eris came around. Let's see what else it says. In my fifth paragraph, I see that it says Eris was discovered in 2005. Now, is 2005 a date or a time? Yes, it is. So this would answer my question. So let's go over here and write in our answer. I would say Eris was discovered in 2005. Oops. Okay, now that I've answered that question, I can move on to my second question. What is Pluto made up of? So I'm looking at a what question. So whenever I'm looking at a what question, I'm thinking about nouns or actions that answer the question. So it's talking about Pluto, and it's also talking about what is Pluto made up of. So because Pluto was mentioned in the beginning of my text, I'm going to look at the beginning. These first two paragraphs talk about how Pluto is no longer a planet and that they stopped teaching it in schools after 2006, so it's not in these first two paragraphs. Let's move on to the third paragraph. The first sentence of my third paragraph says, Pluto is made up almost entirely of rock and ice. So this answers my question because the nouns rock and ice describe what Pluto is made up of. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to write my sentence. I can say Pluto is made up of rock and ice. Good work. Let's move on to our third question. Our third question is, how long does Pluto's full orbit around the sun last? Okay, so I'm going to be looking for a how question. So whenever I'm answering a how question, I need to be thinking of in what way or by what means. So this question is asking me about Pluto and its orbit around the sun and how long it lasts. So I'm going to look in the beginning section of my story because that's where they really talk about Pluto the most. In paragraph 3, it talks about how Pluto is very far away from Earth and the sun. So let's see if it mentions how long it takes for it to orbit around the sun. This last sentence of our paragraph says Pluto's full orbit around the sun lasts almost 250 Earth years. So that would answer my question. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to write in my answer. I will say Pluto's full orbit lasts almost 250 Earth years. Okay, guys, now we're on our last question. Our last question is, why is Pluto not considered a planet anymore? So I'm going to box in my 5W, which is why, to remind myself that whenever we're answering a why question, we have to think of a reason or a purpose mentioned in the story. So what we're talking about here is, why is Pluto not considered a planet anymore? What happened? What reason did they have for not making it a planet? So in the beginning of my story, we talk about Pluto, and then in the middle of my story, we're talking about how Eris was discovered, and that kind of caused why it was not considered a planet anymore. In paragraph 6, it starts talking about how Eris was discovered and they had to make a decision. This decision was to either make Eris the 10th planet in the solar system, or if Eris and Pluto should not be considered a planet at all. We move on to our next paragraph, and it talks about how scientists made new rules that was for what was counted as a planet. And through these new rules, they decided that Pluto and Eris did not qualify to be a planet. So this is the reason or the purpose why Pluto is no longer considered a planet in our solar system. So now that I've found my evidence in the text, I'm going to write my answer. My answer would be Pluto is not considered a planet anymore because scientists made new rules. I hope that this video was helpful on how to answer the 5W questions. Remember, the 5 W's are who, where, what, when, why, and there also is how. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.